Nationalism by Sir Rabindranath Tagore. Published in 1918. Nationalism in the West. Man's history is being shaped according to the difficulties it encounters. These have offered us problems and claimed their solutions from us, the penalty of non fulfillment being death or degradation. These difficulties have been different in different peoples of the earth, and in the manner of our overcoming them lies our distinction. The Scythians of the earlier period of Asiatic history had to struggle with the scarcity of their natural resources. The easiest solution that they could think of was to organize their whole population, men, women, and children, into bands of robbers, and they were irresistible to those who were chiefly engaged in the constructive work of social cooperation. But fortunately for man, the easiest path is not his truest path. If his nature were not as complex as it is, if it were as simple as that of a pack of hungry wolves, then by this time those hordes of marauders would have overrun the whole earth. But man, when confronted with difficulties, has to acknowledge that he is man, that he has his responsibilities to the higher faculties of his nature, by ignoring which he may achieve success that is immediate perhaps, but that will become a death trap to him. For what are obstacles to the lower creatures are opportunities to the higher life of man. To India has been given her problem from the beginning of history. It is the race problem. Races ethnologically different have in this country come into close contact. This fact has been and still continues to be the most important one in our history. It is our mission to face it and prove our humanity by dealing with it in the fullest truth. Until we fulfill our mission, all other benefits will be denied us. There are other peoples in the world who have to overcome obstacles in their physical surroundings or the menace of their powerful neighbors. They have organized their power till they are not only reasonably free from the tyranny of nature and human neighbors, but have a surplus of it left in their hands to employ against others. But in India, our difficulties being internal, our history has been the history of continual social adjustment and not that of organized power for defense and aggression. Neither the colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism nor the fierce self idolatry of nation worship is the goal of human history. And India has been trying to accomplish her task through social regulation of differences on the one hand and the spiritual recognition of unity on the other. She has made grave errors in setting up the boundary walls too rigidly between races, in perpetuating in her classifications the results of inferiority. Often she has crippled her children's minds and narrowed their lives in order to fit them into her social forms. But for centuries, new experiments have been made and adjustments carried out. Her mission has been like that of a hostess who has to provide proper accommodation for numerous guests whose habits and requirements are different from one another. This gives rise to infinite complexities whose solution depends not merely upon tactfulness but upon sympathy and true realization of the unity of man. Towards this realization have worked from the early time of the Upanishads up to the present moment a series of great spiritual teachers whose one object has been to set at naught all differences of man by the overflow of our consciousness of God. In fact, our history has not been of the rise and fall of kingdoms, of fights for political supremacy. In our country, records of these days have been despised and forgotten, for they in no way represent the true history of our people. Our history is that of our social life and attainment of spiritual ideals. But we feel that our task is not yet done. The world flood has swept over our country, new elements have been introduced, and wider adjustments are waiting to be made. We feel this all the more because the teaching and example of the West have entirely run counter to what we think was given to India to accomplish. In the West, the national machinery of commerce and politics turns out neatly compressed bales of humanity, which have their use and high market value. But they are bound in iron hoops, labeled and separated off with scientific care and precision. Obviously, God made man to be human. But this modern product has such marvelous square cut finish, savoring of gigantic manufacture, that the creator will find it difficult to recognize it as a thing of spirit and a creature made in his own divine image. But I am anticipating. What I was about to say is this: take it in whatever spirit you like. Here is India, of about 50 centuries at least, who tried to live peacefully and think deeply, the India devoid of all politics, the India of no nations, whose one ambition has been to know this world as of soul, to live here every moment of her life in the meek spirit of adoration, in the glad consciousness of an eternal and personal relationship with it. It was upon this remote portion of humanity, childlike in its manner, with the wisdom of the old, that the nation of the West burst in. Through all the fights and intrigues and deceptions of her earlier history, India had remained aloof, because her homes, her fields, her temples of worship, her schools, where her teachers and students lived together in the atmosphere of simplicity and devotion and learning, her village self government with its simple laws and peaceful administration, all these truly belonged to her. But her thrones were not her concern. They passed over her head like clouds, now tinged with purple gorgeousness, now black with the threat of thunder. Often they brought devastations in their wake, but they were like catastrophes of nature whose traces are soon forgotten. But this time it was different. It was not a mere drift over her surface of life, drift of cavalry and foot soldiers, richly caparisoned elephants, white tents and canopies, strings of patient camels bearing the loads of royalty, bands of kettle drums and flutes, marble domes of mosques, palaces and tombs, like the bubbles of the foaming wine of extravagance, stories of treachery and loyal devotion, of changes of fortune, of dramatic surprises of fate. This time it was the nation of the West driving its tentacles of machinery deep down into the soil. Therefore, I say to you, it is we who are called as witnesses to give evidence as to what our nation has been to humanity. We had known the hordes of Moguls and Pathans who invaded India, but we had known them as human races with their own religions and customs, likes and dislikes. We had never known them as a nation. We loved and hated them as occasions arose. We fought for them and against them, talked with them in a language which was theirs as well as our own, and guided the destiny of the empire in which we had our active share. But this time we had to deal, not with kings, not with human races, but with a nation, we who are no nation ourselves. Now, let us, from our own experience, answer the question: what is this nation? A nation, in the sense of the political and economic union of a people, is that aspect which a whole population assumes when organized for a mechanical purpose. Society as such has no ulterior purpose. It is an end in itself. It is a spontaneous self expression of man as a social being. It is a natural regulation of human relationships so that men can develop ideals of life, in cooperation with one another. It has also a political side, but this is only for a special purpose. It is for self preservation. It is merely the side of power, not of human ideals. And in the early days, it had its separate place in society, restricted to the professionals. But when, with the help of science and the perfecting of organization, this power begins to grow and brings in harvests of wealth, then it crosses its boundaries with amazing rapidity. For then it goads all its neighboring societies with greed of material prosperity and consequent mutual jealousy, and by the fear of each other's growth into powerfulness. The time comes when it can stop no longer, for the competition grows keener, organization grows vaster, and selfishness attains supremacy. Trading upon the greed and fear of man, it occupies more and more space in society and at last becomes its ruling force. It is just possible that you have lost through habit consciousness that the living bonds of society are breaking up and giving place to merely mechanical organization. But you see signs of it everywhere. It is owing to this that war has been declared between man and woman, because the natural thread is snapping which holds them together in harmony, because man is driven to professionalism, producing wealth for himself and others, continually turning the wheel of power for his own sake or for the sake of the universal officialdom, leaving woman alone to wither and to die or to fight her own battle unaided. And thus, there where cooperation is natural, has intruded competition. The very psychology of men and women about their mutual relation is changing and becoming the psychology of the primitive fighting elements, rather than of humanity seeking its completeness through the union based upon mutual self surrender. For the elements which have lost their living bond of reality have lost the meaning of their existence. Like gaseous particles forced into a too narrow space, they come in continual conflict with each other till they burst the very arrangement which holds them in bondage. Then look at those who call themselves anarchists, who resent the imposition of power in any form whatever upon the individual. The only reason for this is that power has become too abstract. It is a scientific product made in the political laboratory of the nation through the dissolution of personal humanity. And what is the meaning of these strikes in the economic world, which, like the prickly shrubs in a barren soil, shoot up with renewed vigor each time they are cut down? What but that the wealth producing mechanism is incessantly growing into vast stature out of proportion to all other needs of society, and the full reality of man is more and more crushed under its weight. This state of things inevitably gives rise to eternal feuds among the elements freed from the wholeness and wholesomeness of human ideals. An interminable economic war is waged between capital and labor. For greed of wealth and power can never have a limit, and compromise of self interest can never attain the final spirit of reconciliation. They must go on breeding jealousy and suspicion to the end which only comes through some sudden catastrophe or a spiritual rebirth. When this organization of politics and commerce, whose other name is the nation, becomes all powerful at the cost of the harmony of the higher social life, then it is an evil day for humanity. When a father becomes a gambler and his obligations to his family take the secondary place in his mind, then he is no longer a man, but an automaton led by the power of greed. Then he can do things which, in his normal state of mind, he would be ashamed to do. It is the same thing with society. when it allows itself to be turned into a perfect organization of power, then there are few crimes which it is unable to perpetrate, because success is the object and justification of a machine, while goodness only is the end and purpose of man. When this engine of organization begins to attain a vast size, and those who are mechanics are made into parts of the machine, then the personal man is eliminated to a phantom. Everything becomes a revolution of policy carried out by the human parts of the machine, with no twinge of pity or moral responsibility. It may happen that even through this apparatus, the moral nature of man tries to assert itself, but the whole series of ropes and pulleys creak and cry. The forces of the human heart become entangled among the forces of the human automaton, and only with difficulty can the moral purpose transmit itself into some tortured shape of result. This abstract being, the nation, is ruling India. We have seen in our country some brand of tinned food advertised as entirely made and packed without being touched by hand. This description applies to the governing of India, which is as little touched by the human hand as possible. The governors need not know our language, need not come into personal touch with us, except as officials. They can aid or hinder our aspirations from a disdainful distance. They can lead us on a certain path of policy and then pull us back again with the manipulation of office red tape. The newspapers of England, in whose columns London street accidents are recorded with some decency of pathos, need but take the scantiest notice of calamities which happen in India over areas of land sometimes larger than the British Isles. But we who are governed are not a mere abstraction. We, on our side, are individuals with living sensibilities. What comes to us in the shape of a mere bloodless policy may pierce into the very core of our life, may threaten the whole future of our people with a perpetual helplessness of emasculation, and yet may never touch the chord of humanity on the other side, or touch it in the most inadequately feeble manner. Such wholesale and universal acts of fearful responsibility man can never perform with such a degree of systematic unawareness where he is an individual human being. These only become possible where the man is represented by an octopus of abstractions, sending out its wriggling arms in all directions of space and fixing its innumerable suckers even into the faraway future. In this reign of the nation, the governed are pursued by suspicions, and these are the suspicions of a tremendous mass of organized brain and muscle. Punishments are meted out which leave a trail of miseries across a large bleeding tract of the human heart. But these punishments are dealt by a mere abstract force in which a whole population of a distant country has lost its human personality. I have not come here, however, to discuss the question as it affects my own country, but as it affects the future of all humanity. It is not a question of the British government, but of government by the nation. The nation which is the organized self-interest of a whole people, where it is least human and least spiritual. Our only intimate experience of the nation is with the British nation. And as far as the government by the nation goes, there are reasons to believe that it is one of the best. Then, again, we have to consider that the West is necessary to the East. We are complementary to each other because of our different outlooks upon life, which have given us different aspects of truth. Therefore, if it be true that the spirit of the West has come upon our fields in the guise of a storm, it is nevertheless scattering living seeds that are immortal. And when in India we become able to assimilate in our life what is permanent in Western civilization, we shall be in the position to bring about a reconciliation of these two great worlds. Then will come to an end the one sided dominance, which is galling. What is more, we have to recognize that the history of India does not belong to one particular race, but to a process of creation to which various races of the world contributed: the Dravidians and the Aryans, the ancient Greeks and the Persians, the Mohammedans of the West, and those of Central Asia. Now at last has come the turn of the English to become true to this history and bring to it the tribute of their life. And we neither have the right nor the power to exclude this people from the building of the destiny of India. Therefore, what I say about the nation has more to do with the history of man than specially with that of India. This history has come to a stage when the moral man, the complete man, is more and more giving way, almost without knowing it, to make room for the political and the commercial man, the man of the limited purpose. This process, aided by the wonderful progress in science, is assuming gigantic proportion and power, causing the upset of man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization. We have felt its iron grip at the root of our life, and for the sake of humanity, we must stand up and give warning to all that this nationalism is a cruel epidemic of evil that is sweeping over the human world of the present age and eating into its moral vitality. I have a deep love and a great respect for the British race as human beings. It has produced great hearted men, thinkers of great thoughts, doers of great deeds. It has given rise to a great literature. I know that these people love justice and freedom and hate lies. They are clean in their minds, frank in their manners, true in their friendships. In their behavior, they are honest and reliable. The personal experience which I have had of their literary men has roused my admiration not merely for their power of thought or expression, but for their chivalrous humanity. We have felt the greatness of this people as we feel the sun. But as for the nation, it is for us a thick mist of a stifling nature covering the sun itself. This government by the nation is neither British nor anything else. It is an applied science, and therefore more or less similar in its principles wherever it is used. It is like a hydraulic press whose pressure is impersonal and on that account completely effective. The amount of its power may vary in different engines. Some may even be driven by hand, thus leaving a margin of comfortable looseness in their tension. But in spirit and in method, their differences are small. Our government might have been Dutch or French or Portuguese, and its essential features would have remained much the same as they are now. Only perhaps, in some cases, the organization might not have been so densely perfect, and therefore some shreds of the human might still have been clinging to the wreck, allowing us to deal with something which resembles our own throbbing heart. Before the nation came to rule over us, we had other governments which were foreign, and these, like all governments, had some element of the machine in them. But the difference between them and the government by the nation is like the difference between the handloom and the power loom. In the products of the handloom, the magic of man's living fingers finds its expression, and its hum harmonizes with the music of life. But the power loom is relentlessly lifeless and accurate and monotonous in its production. We must admit that during the personal government of the former days, there have been instances of tyranny, injustice, and extortion. They caused sufferings and unrest from which we are glad to be rescued. The protection of law is not only a boon, but it is a valuable lesson to us. It is teaching us the discipline which is necessary for the stability of civilization and for continuity of progress. We are realizing through it that there is a universal standard of justice to which all men, irrespective of their caste and color, have their equal claim. This reign of law in our present government in India has established order in this vast land inhabited by peoples different in their races and customs. It has made it possible for these peoples to come in closer touch with one another and cultivate a communion of aspiration. But this desire for a common bond of comradeship among the different races of India has been the work of the spirit of the West, not that of the nation of the West. Wherever in Asia the people ever received the true lesson of the West, it is in spite of the Western nation. Only because Japan had been able to resist the dominance of this Western nation could she acquire the benefit of the Western civilization in fullest measure. Though China has been poisoned at the very spring of her moral and physical life by this nation, her struggle to receive the best lessons of the West may yet be successful, if not hindered by the nation. It was only the other day that Persia woke up from her age long sleep at the call of the West, to be instantly trampled into stillness by the nation. The same phenomenon prevails in this country also, where the people are hospitable, but the nation has proved itself to be otherwise, making an Eastern guest feel humiliated to stand before you as a member of the humanity of his own motherland. In India, we are suffering from this conflict between the spirit of the West and the nation of the West. The benefit of the Western civilization is doled out to us in a miserly measure by the nation, which tries to regulate the degree of nutrition as near the 0 point of vitality as possible. The portion of education allotted to us is so raggedly insufficient that it ought to outrage the sense of decency of a Western humanity. We have seen in these countries how the people are encouraged and trained and given every facility to fit themselves for the great movements of commerce and industry spreading over the world. While in India, the only assistance we get is merely to be jeered at by the nation for lagging behind. While depriving us of our opportunities and reducing our education to the minimum required for conducting a foreign government, this nation pacifies its conscience by calling us names, by sedulously giving currency to the arrogant cynicism that the East is East and the West is West, and never the twain shall meet. If we must believe our schoolmaster in his taunt that after nearly 2 centuries of his tutelage, India not only remains unfit for self government, but unable to display originality in her intellectual attainments, must we ascribe it to something in the nature of Western culture and our inherent incapacity to receive it, or to the judicious niggardliness of the nation that has taken upon itself the white man's burden of civilizing the East? That Japanese people have some qualities which we lack, we may admit, but that our intellect is naturally unproductive compared to theirs, we cannot accept even from them whom it is dangerous for us to contradict. The truth is that the spirit of conflict and conquest is at the origin and in the center of Western nationalism. Its basis is not social cooperation. It has evolved a perfect organization of power, but not spiritual idealism. It is like the pack of predatory creatures that must have its victims. With all its heart, it cannot bear to see its hunting grounds converted into cultivated fields. In fact, these nations are fighting among themselves for the extension of their victims and their reserve forests. Therefore, the Western nation acts like a dam to check the free flow of Western civilization into the country of the no nation. Because this civilization is the civilization of power. Therefore, it is exclusive. It is naturally unwilling to open its sources of power to those whom it has selected for its purposes of exploitation. But all the same, moral law is the law of humanity, and the exclusive civilization which thrives upon others who are barred from its benefit carries its own death sentence in its moral limitations. The slavery that it gives rise to unconsciously drains its own love of freedom dry. The helplessness with which it weighs down its world of victims exerts its force of gravitation every moment upon the power that creates it. And the greater part of the world, which is being denuded of its self sustaining life by the nation, will one day become the most terrible of all its burdens, ready to drag it down into the bottom of destruction. Whenever power removes all checks from its path to make its career easy, it triumphantly rides into its ultimate crash of death. Its moral brake becomes slacker every day without its knowing it, and its slippery path of ease becomes its path of doom. Of all things in Western civilization, those which this Western nation has given us in a most generous measure are law and order. While the small feeding bottle of our education is nearly dry and sanitation sucks its own thumb in despair, the military organization, the magisterial offices, the police, the criminal investigation department, the secret spy system attain to an abnormal girth in their waists, occupying every inch of our country. This is to maintain order. But is not this order merely a negative good? Is it not for giving people's life greater opportunities for the freedom of development? Its perfection is the perfection of an eggshell, whose true value lies in the security it affords to the chick and its nourishment, and not in the convenience it offers to the person at the breakfast table. Mere administration is unproductive. It is not creative, not being a living thing. It is a steamroller, formidable in its weight and power, having its uses, but it does not help the soil to become fertile. When after its enormous toil it comes to offer us its boon of peace, we can but murmur under our breath that peace is good, but not more so than life, which is God's own great boon. On the other hand, our former governments were woefully lacking in many of the advantages of the modern government. But because those were not the governments by the nation, their texture was loosely woven, leaving big gaps through which our own life sent its threads and imposed its designs. I am quite sure in those days we had things that were extremely distasteful to us. But we know that when we walk barefooted upon ground strewn with gravel, our feet come gradually to adjust themselves to the caprices of the inhospitable earth. While if the tiniest particle of gravel finds its lodgment inside our shoes, we can never forget and forgive its intrusion. And these shoes are the government by the nation. It is tight. It regulates our steps with a closed up system, within which our feet have only the slightest liberty to make their own adjustments. Therefore, when you produce your statistics to compare the number of gravels which our feet had to encounter in former days with the paucity in the present regime, they hardly touch the real points. It is not a question of the number of outside obstacles, but the comparative powerlessness of the individual to cope with them. And this narrowness of freedom is an evil which is more radical, not because of its quantity, but because of its nature. And we cannot but acknowledge this paradox that while the spirit of the West marches under its banner of freedom, the nation of the West forges its iron chains of organization, which are the most relentless and unbreakable that have ever been manufactured in the whole history of man. When the humanity of India was not under the government of the organization, the elasticity of change was great enough to encourage men of power and spirit to feel that they had their destinies in their own hands. The hope of the unexpected was never absent, and a freer play of imagination on the part both of the governor and the governed had its effect in the making of history. We were not confronted with a future which was a dead white wall of granite blocks, eternally guarding against the expression and extension of our own powers, the hopelessness of which lies in the reason that these powers are becoming atrophied at their very roots by the scientific process of paralysis. For every single individual in the country of the no nation is completely in the grip of a whole nation, whose tireless vigilance, being the vigilance of a machine, has not the human power to overlook or to discriminate. At the least pressing of its button, the monster organization becomes all eyes, whose ugly stare of inquisitiveness cannot be avoided by a single person amongst the immense multitude of the ruled. At the least turn of its screw, by the fraction of an inch, the grip is tightened to the point of suffocation around every man, woman, and child of a vast population, for whom no escape is imaginable in their own country, or even in any country outside their own. It is the continual and stupendous dead pressure of this inhuman upon the living human under which the modern world is groaning. Not merely the subject races, but you who live under the delusion that you are free, are every day sacrificing your freedom and humanity to this fetish of nationalism, living in the dense, poisonous atmosphere of worldwide suspicion and greed and panic. I have seen in Japan the voluntary submission of the whole people to the trimming of their minds and clipping of their freedom by their government, which through various educational agencies regulates their thoughts, manufactures their feelings, becomes suspiciously watchful when they show signs of inclining toward the spiritual, leading them through a narrow path, not toward what is true, but what is necessary for the complete welding of them into one uniform mass according to its own recipe. The people accept this all pervading mental slavery with cheerfulness and pride because of their nervous desire to turn themselves into a machine of power called the nation and emulate other machines in their collective worldliness. When questioned as to the wisdom of its course, the newly converted fanatic of nationalism answers that so long as nations are rampant in this world, we have not the option freely to develop our higher humanity. We must utilize every faculty that we possess to resist the evil by assuming it ourselves in the fullest degree. For the only brotherhood possible in the modern world is the brotherhood of hooliganism, the recognition of the fraternal bond of love between Japan and Russia, which has lately been celebrated with an immense display of rejoicing in Japan, was not owing to any sudden recrudescence of the spirit of Christianity or of Buddhism, but it was a bond established according to the modern faith in a surer relationship of mutual menace of bloodshedding. Yes, one cannot but acknowledge that these facts are the facts of the world of the nation, and the only moral of it is that all the peoples of the earth should strain their physical, moral, and intellectual resources to the utmost to defeat one another in the wrestling match of powerfulness. In the ancient days, Sparta paid all her attention to becoming powerful. She did become so by crippling her humanity and died of the amputation. But it is no consolation to us to know that the weakening of humanity from which the present age is suffering is not limited to the subject races, and that its ravages are even more radical, because insidious and voluntary in peoples who are hypnotized into believing that they are free. This bartering of your higher aspirations of life for profit and power has been your own free choice, and I leave you there, at the wreckage of your soul, contemplating your protuberant prosperity. But will you never be called to answer for organizing the instincts of self aggrandizement of whole peoples into perfection and calling it good? I ask you, what disaster has there ever been in the history of man, in its darkest period, like this terrible disaster of the nation, fixing its fangs deep into the naked flesh of the world, taking permanent precautions against its natural relaxation? You, the people of the West who have manufactured this abnormality, can you imagine the desolating despair of this haunted world of suffering man, possessed by the ghastly abstraction of the organizing man? Can you put yourself into the position of the peoples who seem to have been doomed to an eternal damnation of their own humanity, who not only must suffer continual curtailment of their manhood, but even raise their voices in paeans of praise for the benignity of a mechanical apparatus in its interminable parody of providence? Have you not seen, since the commencement of the existence of the nation, that the dread of it has been the one goblin dread with which the whole world has been trembling? Wherever there is a dark corner, there is the suspicion of its secret malevolence, and people live in a perpetual distrust of its back, where it has no eyes. Every sound of a footstep, every rustle of movement in the neighborhood sends a thrill of terror all around. And this terror is the parent of all that is base in man's nature. It makes one almost openly unashamed of inhumanity. Clever lies become matters of self congratulation. Solemn pledges become a farce, laughable for their very solemnity. The nation, with all its paraphernalia of power and prosperity, its flags and pious hymns, its blasphemous prayers in the churches, and the literary mock thunders of its patriotic bragging, cannot hide the fact that the nation is the greatest evil for the nation, that all its precautions are against it, and any new birth of its fellow in the world is always followed in its mind by the dread of a new peril. Its one wish is to trade on the feebleness of the rest of the world, like some insects that are bred in the paralyzed flesh of victims kept just enough alive to make them toothsome and nutritious. Therefore, it is ready to send its poisonous fluid into the vitals of the other living peoples, who, not being nations, are harmless. For this, the nation has had, and still has, its richest pasture in Asia. Great China, rich with her ancient wisdom and social ethics, her discipline of industry and self control, is like a whale awakening the lust of spoil in the heart of the nation. She is already carrying in her quivering flesh harpoons sent by the unerring aim of the nation, the creature of science and selfishness. Her pitiful attempt to shake off her traditions of humanity, her social ideals, and spend her last exhausted resources in drilling herself into modern efficiency is thwarted at every step by the nation. It is tightening its financial ropes round her, trying to drag her up on the shore and cut her into pieces, and then go and offer public thanksgiving to God for supporting the one existing evil and shattering the possibility of a new one. And for all this, the nation has been claiming the gratitude of history and all eternity for its exploitation, ordering its band of praise to be struck up from end to end of the world, declaring itself to be the salt of the earth, the flower of humanity, the blessing of God, hurled with all his force upon the naked skulls of the world of no nations. I know what your advice will be. You will say, form yourselves into a nation and resist this encroachment of the nation. But is this the true advice? That of a man to a man? Why should this be a necessity? I could well believe you if you had said, be more good, more just, more true in your relation to man. Control your greed, make your life wholesome in its simplicity, and let your consciousness of the divine in humanity be more perfect in its expression. But must you say that it is not the soul, but the machine, which is of the utmost value to ourselves, and that man's salvation depends upon his disciplining himself into a perfection of the dead rhythm of wheels and counter wheels? That machine must be pitted against machine and nation against nation in an endless bullfight of politics? You say these machines will come into an agreement for their mutual protection based upon a conspiracy of fear. But will this federation of steam boilers supply you with a soul which has her conscience and her God? What is to happen to that larger part of the world where fear will have no hand in restraining you? Whatever safety they now enjoy, those countries of no nation, from the unbridled license of forge and hammer and turnscrew, results from the mutual jealousy of the powers. But when, instead of being numerous separate machines, they become riveted into one organized gregariousness of gluttony, commercial and political, what remotest chance of hope will remain for those others who have lived and suffered, have loved and worshipped, have thought deeply and worked with meekness, but whose only crime has been that they have not organized? But you say, that does not matter. The unfit must go to the wall. They shall die, and this is science. No, for the sake of your own salvation, I say they shall live, and this is truth. It is extremely bold of me to say so, but I assert that man's world is a moral world, not because we blindly agree to believe it, but because it is so in truth, which would be dangerous for us to ignore. And this moral nature of man cannot be divided into convenient compartments for its preservation. You cannot secure it for your home consumption with protective tariff walls, while in foreign parts making it enormously accommodating in its free trade of license. Has not this truth already come home to you now, when this cruel war has driven its claws into the vitals of Europe? When her hoard of wealth is bursting into smoke and her humanity is shattered into bits on her battlefields? You ask in amazement, what has she done to deserve this? The answer is that the West has been systematically petrifying her moral nature in order to lay a solid foundation for her gigantic abstractions of efficiency. She has all along been starving the life of the personal man into that of the professional. In your medieval age in Europe, the simple and the natural man, with all his violent passions and desires, was engaged in trying to find out a reconciliation in the conflict between the flesh and the spirit. All through the turbulent career of her vigorous youth, the temporal and the spiritual forces both acted strongly upon her nature and were molding it into completeness of moral personality. Europe owes all her greatness in humanity to that period of discipline, the discipline of the man in his human integrity. Then came the age of intellect, of science. We all know that intellect is impersonal. Our life and our heart are one with us. But our mind can be detached from the personal man and then only can it freely move in its world of thoughts. Our intellect is an ascetic who wears no clothes, takes no food, knows no sleep, has no wishes, feels no love or hatred or pity for human limitations, who only reasons unmoved through the vicissitudes of life. It burrows to the roots of things because it has no personal concern with the thing itself. The grammarian walks straight through all poetry and goes to the root of words without obstruction, because he is not seeking reality but law. When he finds the law, he is able to teach people how to master words. This is a power, the power which fulfills some special usefulness, some particular need of man. Reality is the harmony which gives to the component parts of a thing and the equilibrium of the whole. You break it and have in your hands the nomadic atoms fighting against one another, therefore unmeaning. Those who covet power try to get mastery of these aboriginal fighting elements and through some narrow channels force them into some violent service for some particular needs of man. This satisfaction of man's needs is a great thing. It gives him freedom in the material world. It confers on him the benefit of a greater range of time and space. He can do things in a shorter time and occupies a larger space with more thoroughness of advantage. Therefore, he can easily outstrip those who live in a world of a slower time and of space less fully occupied. This progress of power attains more and more rapidity of pace, and for the reason that it is a detached part of man, it soon outruns the complete humanity. The moral man remains behind, because it has to deal with the whole reality, not merely with the law of things, which is impersonal and therefore abstract. Thus, man, with his mental and material power far outgrowing his moral strength, is like an exaggerated giraffe whose head has suddenly shot up miles away from the rest of him, making normal communication difficult to establish. This greedy head, with its huge dental organization, has been munching all the topmost foliage of the world. But the nourishment is too late in reaching his digestive organs, and his heart is suffering from want of blood. Of this present disharmony in man's nature, the West seems to have been blissfully unconscious. The enormity of its material success has diverted all its attention towards self congratulation on its bulk. The optimism of its logic goes on basing the calculations of its good fortune upon the indefinite prolongation of its railway lines toward eternity. It is superficial enough to think that all tomorrows are merely todays with the repeated additions of 24 hours. It has no fear of the chasm which is opening wider every day between man's ever growing storehouses and the emptiness of his hungry humanity. Logic does not know that under the lowest bed of endless strata of wealth and comforts, earthquakes are being hatched to restore the balance of the moral world. And one day, the gaping gulf of spiritual vacuity will draw into its bottom the store of things that have their eternal love for the dust. Man in his fullness is not powerful, but perfect. Therefore, to turn him into mere power, you have to curtail his soul as much as possible. When we are fully human, we cannot fly at one another's throats. Our instincts of social life, our traditions of moral ideals stand in the way. If you want me to take to butchering human beings, you must break up that wholeness of my humanity through some discipline which makes my will dead, my thoughts numb, my movements automatic, and then, from the dissolution of the complex personal man, will come out that abstraction, that destructive force which has no relation to human truth, and therefore can be easily brutal or mechanical. take away man from his natural surroundings, from the fullness of his communal life, with all its living associations of beauty and love and social obligations, and you will be able to turn him into so many fragments of a machine for the production of wealth on a gigantic scale. Turn a tree into a log, and it will burn for you, but it will never bear living flowers and fruit. This process of dehumanizing has been going on in commerce and politics, and out of the long birth throes of mechanical energy has been born this fully developed apparatus of magnificent power and surprising appetite, which has been christened in the West as the nation. As I have hinted before, because of its quality of abstraction, it has, with the greatest ease, gone far ahead of the complete moral man. And having the conscience of a ghost and the callous perfection of an automaton, it is causing disasters of which the volcanic dissipations of the youthful moon would be ashamed to be brought into comparison. As a result, the suspicion of man for man stings all the limbs of this civilization like the hairs of the nettle. Each country is casting its net of espionage into the slimy bottom of the others, fishing for their secrets, the treacherous secrets which brew in the oozy depths of diplomacy. And what is their secret service but the nation's underground trade in kidnapping, murder, and treachery, and all the ugly crimes bred in the depth of rottenness? Because each nation has its own history of thieving and lies and broken faith. Therefore, there can only flourish international suspicion and jealousy, and international moral shame becomes anemic to a degree of ludicrousness. The nation's bagpipe of righteous indignation has so often changed its tune according to the variation of time and to the altered groupings of the alliances of diplomacy that it can be enjoyed with amusement as the variety performance of the political music hall. I am just coming from my visit to Japan, where I exhorted this young nation to take its stand upon the higher ideals of humanity and never to follow the West in its acceptance of the organized selfishness of nationalism as its religion, never to gloat upon the feebleness of its neighbors, never to be unscrupulous in its behavior to the weak, where it can be gloriously mean with impunity, while turning its right cheek of brighter humanity for the kiss of admiration to those who have the power to deal it a blow. Some of the newspapers praised my utterances for their poetical qualities, while adding with a leer that it was the poetry of a defeated people. I felt they were right. Japan had been taught in a modern school the lesson how to become powerful. The schooling is done, and she must enjoy the fruits of her lessons. The West, in the voice of her thundering cannon, had said at the door of Japan, "Let there be a nation." And there was a nation. And now that it has come into existence, why do you not feel in your heart of hearts a pure feeling of gladness and say that it is good? Why is it that I saw in an English paper an expression of bitterness at Japan's boasting of her superiority of civilization, the thing that the British, along with other nations, has been carrying on for ages without blushing? Because the idealism of selfishness must keep itself drunk with a continual dose of self laudation. But the same vices which seem so natural and innocuous in its own life make it surprised and angry at their unpleasantness when seen in other nations. Therefore, when you see the Japanese nation, created in your own image, launched in its career of national boastfulness, you shake your head and say, "It is not good." Has it not been one of the causes that raised the cry on these shores for preparedness to meet one more power of evil with a greater power of injury? Japan protests that she has her Bushido, that she can never be treacherous to America, to whom she owes her gratitude. But you find it difficult to believe her, for the wisdom of the nation is not in its faith in humanity, but in its complete distrust. You say to yourself that it is not with Japan of the Bushido, the Japan of the moral ideals, that you have to deal. It is with the abstraction of the popular selfishness. It is with the nation. And nation can only trust nation where their interests coalesce, or at least do not conflict. In fact, your instinct tells you that the advent of another people into the arena of nationality makes another addition to the evil which contradicts all that is highest in man and proves by its success that unscrupulousness is the way to prosperity, and goodness is good for the weak, and God is the only remaining consolation of the defeated. Yes, this is the logic of the nation, and it will never heed the voice of truth and goodness. It will go on in its ring dance of moral corruption, linking steel unto steel and machine unto machine, trampling under its tread all the sweet flowers of simple faith and the living ideals of man. But we delude ourselves into thinking that humanity in the modern days is more to the front than ever before. The reason of this self delusion is because man is served with the necessaries of life in greater profusion, and his physical ills are being alleviated with more efficacy. But the chief part of this is done not by moral sacrifice, but by intellectual power. In quantity, it is great, but it springs from the surface and spreads over the surface. Knowledge and efficiency are powerful in their outward effect, but they are the servants of man, not the man himself. Their service is like the service in a hotel, where it is elaborate, but the host is absent. It is more convenient than hospitable. Therefore, we must not forget that the scientific organizations vastly spreading in all directions are strengthening our power, but not our humanity. With the growth of power, the cult of the self worship of the nation grows in ascendancy, and the individual willingly allows the nation to take donkey rides upon his back. And there happens the anomaly which must have such disastrous effects, that the individual worships with all sacrifices a god which is morally much inferior to himself. This could never have been possible if the God had been as real as the individual. Let me give an illustration of this in point. In some parts of India, it has been enjoined as an act of great piety for a widow to go without food and water on a particular day every fortnight. This often leads to cruelty, unmeaning, and inhuman. And yet, men are not by nature cruel to such a degree. But this piety, being a mere unreal abstraction, completely deadens the moral sense of the individual, just as the man who would not hurt an animal unnecessarily would cause horrible suffering to a large number of innocent creatures when he drugs his feelings with the abstract idea of sport. Because these ideas are the creations of our intellect, because they are logical classifications, therefore they can so easily hide in their midst the personal man. And the idea of the nation is one of the most powerful anesthetics that man has invented. Under the influence of its fumes, the whole people can carry out its systematic program of the most virulent self seeking without being in the least aware of its moral perversion. In fact, feeling dangerously resentful if it is pointed out. But can this go on indefinitely, continually producing barrenness of moral insensibility upon a large tract of our living nature? Can it escape its nemesis forever? Has this giant power of mechanical organization no limit in this world against which it may shatter itself all the more completely because of its terrible strength and velocity? Do you believe that evil can be permanently kept in check by competition with evil, and that conference of prudence can keep the devil chained in its makeshift cage of mutual agreement? This European war of nations is the war of retribution. Man, the person, must protest for his very life against the heaping up of things where there should be the heart, and systems and policies where there should flow living human relationship. The time has come when, for the sake of the whole outraged world, Europe should fully know in her own person the terrible absurdity of the thing called the nation. The nation has thriven long upon mutilated humanity. Men, the fairest creations of God, came out of the national manufactory in huge numbers as war making and money making puppets, ludicrously vain of their pitiful perfection of mechanism. Human society grew more and more into a marionette show of politicians, soldiers, manufacturers, and bureaucrats pulled by wire arrangements of wonderful efficiency. But the apotheosis of selfishness can never make its interminable breed of hatred and greed, fear and hypocrisy, suspicion and tyranny, an end in themselves. These monsters grow into huge shapes, but never into harmony. And this nation may grow onto an unimaginable corpulence, not of a living body, but of steel and steam and office buildings, till its deformity can contain no longer its ugly voluminousness, till it begins to crack and gape, breathe gas and fire in gasps, and its death rattles sound in cannon roars. In this war, the death throes of the nation have commenced. Suddenly, all its mechanism going mad. It has begun the dance of the furies, shattering its own limbs, scattering them into the dust. It is the fifth act of the tragedy of the unreal. Those who have any faith in man cannot but fervently hope that the tyranny of the nation will not be restored to all its former teeth and claws, to its far reaching iron arms, and its immense inner cavity, all stomach and no heart. That man will have his new birth in the freedom of his individuality from the enveloping vagueness of abstraction. The veil has been raised, and in this frightful war, the West has stood face to face with her own creation to which she had offered her soul. She must know what it truly is. She had never let herself suspect what slow decay and decomposition was secretly going on in her moral nature, which often broke out in doctrines of skepticism, but still oftener and in still more dangerously subtle manner showed itself in her unconsciousness of the mutilation and insult that she had been inflicting upon a vast part of the world. Now she must know the truth nearer home. And then there will come from her own children those who will break themselves free from the slavery of this illusion, this perversion of brotherhood founded upon self seeking, those who will own themselves as God's children, and as no bond slaves of machinery, which turns souls into commodities and life into compartments, which, with its iron claws, scratches out the heart of the world and knows not what it has done. And we of no nations of the world, whose heads have been bowed to the dust, will know that this dust is more sacred than the bricks which build the pride of power. For this dust is fertile of life and of beauty and worship. We shall thank God that we were made to wait in silence through the night of despair, had to bear the insult of the proud and the strong man's burden. Yet all through it, though our hearts quaked with doubt and fear, never could we blindly believe in the salvation which machinery offered to man, but we held fast to our trust in God and the truth of the human soul. and we can still cherish the hope that when power becomes ashamed to occupy its throne and is ready to make way for love, when the morning comes for cleansing the blood-stained steps of the nation along the high road of humanity, we shall be called upon to bring our own vessel of sacred water, the water of worship, to sweeten the history of man into purity, and with its sprinkling make the trampled dust of the centuries blessed with fruitfulness.